welcome to Dice on Ice. My name is Megan.
My name's Connor.
And today, this is our episode of Let's Chill, where we have a very special guest with us, Jake from Mini Terrain Domain. First off, you can do a little bit of introductions if you'd like.
All right. I'll go uncharacteristic and keep it brief. I run the channel Mini Terrain Domain, which is both a YouTube channel and a Twitch channel where we primarily live stream D&D, actual play games, long-running campaigns, one-shots, things like that. And I also do crafting as well, crafting tutorials for tabletop terrain. And that's pretty much what the Mini Terrain Domain brand is.
So today, we are going to be talking about pre-written modules. Now, you've run quite a few, and I've been in quite a few of pre-written modules, especially with the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And so we kind of wanted to just talk about the process by which you start running a module, some of the hiccups that you might run into, and some of the relationships between the DM and players when it comes to a pre-written module. Because I think there's some very special things when it comes to having something that anyone can just pick up and buy and basically have the adventure right in front of them. So the first thing we wanted to ask was, what do you look for in a pre-written module? Like, is there anything that really draws your attention to them?
I think the more, now that we're at a point where 5th edition has been out for about 4 years, and I don't know the exact count, but there are several, you can see some of them on my shelf behind me. There are several pre-written modules now. It's a matter of just finding that thing that's going to be a combination of the style of adventure. Is it a Indiana Jones through the jungles kind of adventure? Is it a kind of a Tomb Raider in the snowy mountains, spelunking and or tomb robbing kind of thing? Is it a gothic horror like Curse of Strahd? So I think that's the first thing that I look for. And honestly, I'll pretty much run just about anything out of the box or out of the book. So playability is the next thing that I look for. You know, how easy is it for me to look at it and go, yeah, I can go ahead and in just a few weeks, I can get a group together and start running this.
So let's say you found one that's just caught your eye. You know, oh, this one looks cool, right? Flashy cover page. You flip it open, and you're like, interesting. You know, I'm gonna run this for my players next week. What's the first thing you actually look for in the book or in this module, or whatever it's a PDF maybe that you found off of some third party?
The first thing that I'm looking for is how the adventure's laid out to determine, and what I mean by that is I want to determine, is it a linear progression where a lot of dungeon crawl type adventures might be, or is it a multiple paths that still is sort of a branching form of the linear progression, or is it a more of an investigative where you have central locations and the characters can kind of move around to different places? And to elaborate on that a little bit, I think something like the very first modules, 2 modules that came out for 5th edition were the Tyranny of Dragons storyline, Horde of the Dragon Queen, and Rise of Tiamat. And the way that's set up is it is a very linearly progressive storyline. You move from point A to point B to point C, and you can deviate a lot. Tomb of Annihilation, you have multiple paths depending on choices that the players make at key points in the story, but you're still kind of contained within this sandbox of the jungle. And then you have an adventure like Princes of the Apocalypse, where you have all of these super dungeons, but you realistically, your players can go in any order they want. And the DM just has to sort of scale up or down based on who's there, but they make their decisions based on the different towns they go to and the pieces of information they pick up, because you have, multiple factions that you're working with. So I just need to understand, how to approach it by understanding what type of a storyline it is.
And so do you read through the book, say from beginning to end, cover to cover, Do you read all the way through it? Do you skim it first, get some sort of an idea before you run the first session? Or how much prep do you do before session 1 or even session 0?
So do you want me to tell you what I do, or what people should do?
Well,
I'll sort of
practically preach, huh?
I'll sort of a foot in both practices here. So the first thing that I do when I find a storyline, when I pick up a new book, the very first thing I do is I just flip through it from cover to cover. I'm just looking for those elements. Like I said, I'm looking to see what type of a storyline it is. I'm looking at the art, which is going to really help to inform. I think a lot of us are inspired by the artwork in any RPG book or artwork around RPGs when it comes to making characters, stuff like that. I'm looking at roll tables. I'm looking at just the way the adventure is laid out from a dungeon master's perspective. How easily is it on a glance to pick up on what are the key points of this adventure? And by the time I'm done flipping through it, and that can take, 30, 40 minutes, an hour, I should have a sense of what that adventure entails. Then read through it from cover to cover. Some will say read through it 2 or 3 times. Full disclosure, I am not very good at that. I'm a very low prep dungeon master. And as long as I kind of get a sense of what's going to take place in the session and I understand what the possibilities are, essentially, I mean, you could boil that down to what's to the north, the south, the west, and the east, so that I can make adjustments when my players do the opposite of what I expected. As long as I understand that, I feel like I'm prepared to move along with the session, and I can kind of fill in the gaps and improv. The downside to that is if I don't look far enough ahead, I'm not as able to plant seeds early on for certain things. It's an area that, I've been doing this since 5th edition came out, a little bit before that. So I've been DMing for about 5 years and, on a weekly basis. And it's still a thing that I'm improving on. But yeah, that's definitely what you want to do is you need to read through the entire book. And then prior to running sessions, you need to read through that whole section, whether it's a chapter or a few encounters, or, it depends. Do you run, 2-hour sessions, or do you run these epic 8-hour sessions? That's really going to inform how you approach it too.
Yeah, I'm always just like taken aback or even like, I guess, fearful of running pre-made games that are these campaigns, because I'm not sure what story elements are supposed to be like, kind of foreshadowed early, or what kind of plot hooks do I need to make sure I have? Because what if I just forget at the table? I'm always a forgetful DM. I feel like I'm like studying for a test almost when I'm looking at these books, and I don't feel like playing a game should be studying for a test.
Well, and that's why one of the great things about 5th edition D&D, and there are a few other systems out there that have this more narrative approach, that it accommodates all of those styles. Whether you're the DM that's going to read through the entire module, take copious notes, make documents with all these interlinked factions and all this kind of stuff, or are you just going to look for those little gems that stick out? Which I tend to kind of do that. I pluck little gems, but I'm more of the style that I'm going to use the book and the world that's set up, and I want the story of the characters to drive this adventure. I want their individual stories. So I'm paying more attention to my characters within that setting.
Yeah, in your games, you are very encouraging of letting the players put their own spin on things, letting them kind of insert their background into the story, which to me is very counterintuitive when you look at a pre-written module, because you don't really think of how can these two things really kind of marry each other when they're so different. Do you worry about that? Do you think that, what if, my players really deviate from what the storyline is supposed to go? Do you gradually lead them back, or do you how do you navigate through that?
Part of it comes with the more familiar you are with the module that you're running, the easier it's going to be to marry those story elements together. And if you don't mind, I'll use an anecdotal piece from a game that we run that both of you are in now, the Tomb of Annihilation campaign that we're running, Cult of Personality. Megan, you're playing Berlinia, who's an Aesimer Warlock, Celestial, and the background that you created is this whole story that Berlinia was a part of an organization called the Weeping Friars, and there was it's kind of a not exactly a benevolent monastery or a religious sect, as demonstrated by Brother Matthias, who is a violet-skinned tiefling. And I let you kind of establish, and you did such a beautiful job. And I really think a big part of what drove Berlinia's character was these wrappings that she wore around her arms, these crimson wrappings that when it came time to be, through circumstances, those came off. You lost those wrappings. It was revealed that they were covering scars. And we kind of worked together to say that that's your arcane focus, is those scars. And I let you drive a lot of that as the character and the player. And then I have been taking places where it makes sense within the story by knowing the adventure, knowing where the temples are in Port Nyanzaru, that it made sense for there to be an encounter with Brother Matthias. And without revealing anything, I can say that there are certain elements of the story that, regardless of where you go, I could say, well, it would make sense for him to be aligned with this organization or this storyline. But if they don't go that route, he also lines up with this storyline. And yeah, just kind of play around with it in that way. I think having alternate paths helps in just about any approach to running a module. Having a backup plan is a great way to approach that too.
So when you're running your module, have you ever had that like, oh shit moment of these players are doing something that I didn't want, or that in a pre-written module you have these certain things set in certain places and these certain almost like pigeonholed events, I would feel like, of certain important NPCs. So how would you navigate that for, say, a newer GM, or what advice would you give to, say, a newer GM who wants to run this but doesn't want to feel like they're railroading their players?
A dirty secret of running adventure modules is that your players are always on rails. Even when they're not, they really are. And I'll just touch on this because I know this is something you want to kind of maybe address with a different question, but it kind of comes down to the social contract that you make with your players when you agree that you're going to run a module. So again, using anecdotal examples here, which makes perfect sense since the both of you are in this game, though this example predates Connor's involvement. An example of kind of these things kind of happen in succession. I'm terrible at running sandbox. I freely admit that. So I tend to run a sort of on rails where the players reach points where they make a decision, and then think of it like a railroad roundtable. Then we shift and then they go in that direction. If there's things that they critically need to reach, I might adjust where those things are. But I let you guys wander around for a really long time in Tomb of Annihilation. There was a lot of great story development that happened, but I was trying to be true to the travel aspects of the module, and it just wasn't a good fit. It took way too long for us to realize it. Not to to lessen the impact of in those first several episodes. There was some fantastic character development and events that happened and things like that. But you spent a lot of time not really getting anywhere. So I started looking at some of the areas where Tomb of Annihilation is one of those things where you're never, unless you're playing an epic campaign, you're never going to hit all the spots on the map. It gives it fantastic replayability, which not every module does. So it also gives you the freedom to take some of these smaller encounter locations and just move them. If there is a bridge that is way in the southwest and they're spending all their time in the north, move that bridge to the north. And this is from our game, if there is an airship wreck that is way over on the east side of the map and the players are in the northwest wandering around like Moses and the Israelites in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. I just moved that airship crash to where you guys were so that it was in your path so that you encountered it. And we wound up spending like 3 or 4 sessions at that airship crash. And that's where the other thing happened that I didn't account for. And that was when the crew and your guide, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched, I mean, we're on episode 30 something, and this is going back a ways, but your guide, Salida, who'd been with you for about 20 days at this point, it was revealed that she was a Yuan-Ti spy, and they were trying to kidnap you in the night, which, again, peek behind the curtains was me as a DM saying, all right, they're stuck here and I need to move them somewhere else to make things happen. The things that have taken us about 5 to 10 sessions to do are because of Marquise. Those you guys would have been to much further along in where you were in the last 3 sessions if Marquise, and I should say Dunala, his sorcerer character, or I'm not really sure what Dunala is. He's towing the line of a sorcerer, mage, whatever. But he basically, while you guys were all unconscious from the sleep spell that was put on you by the Yuan-Ti, he succeeded past his perception to notice somebody sneaking up on him and proceeded to fireball everybody and everything, and then caught Salida in the act. So as a GM, I had to figure out, oh crap, my guide's been exposed way earlier than I wanted her to be. And it actually, in ways you'll never know, it dramatically altered my plans for Salida and her interaction with your party and certain events that honestly you guys will probably never encounter. But I mean, that's life, I guess, when you make certain choices. So those sessions kept me on my toes. And a big part of that is because I had enough of a familiarity with the subject matter, and I'm a decent enough GM that I can just make shit up on the fly and it'll work.
A lot of what I'm hearing is to make sure that you keep your ideas fluid. Keep it within the realm of the module of the campaign, but make sure that you're able to move ideas around, make different pathways, which I think is really, really
I'm hearing like, don't be afraid to just like take the module and kind of just squish and spunk and just kind of move it around and play with it like putty, which kind of leads to the next kind of issue, which is what happens if one of your players has already read this module before.
Yeah, speaking of Marquise, that's a great segue.
Like, is that necessarily a pitfall? Like, or is it like, would you not let them play?
Honestly, it depends on the player. I know people that if they had read a module and they promised me up and down that they would not metagame, they would metagame the crap out of it. They would absolutely use knowledge that they had from reading it to go, no, we don't want to go with this guide. We want to go with this guide. No, we don't want to go with these people. I mean, a lot of people do that anyway, just because of their knowledge of certain monsters. And the more you play, you just start to pick up this knowledge. You're like, oh, I know what that is. Marquise told me up front. I mean, Marquise pretty much, as soon as the module comes out, he gets it and he reads it cover to cover. And I knew he had read Tomb of Annihilation. I think he's been doing a really great job of not metagaming it.
Because I almost think a kind of a good side to metagaming too. Let's say that you are a person who's read the module, and it's kind of a more sandboxy one, like this Tomb of Annihilation. You kind of know where the pivotal plot moments are, and so you know how to I guess steer the party to further the plot instead of just like sidetracking around, if that makes sense.
The only problem with that is you could be working against your dungeon master if you don't know what they're planning to do with what you read. They could be taking just elements of it. I have a home group that has touched on pieces of Storm King's Thunder, Curse of Strahd, Out of the Abyss, but they've never run through those modules in their entirety because I've just plucked elements out of them. And then I've been in that position where with Curse of Strahd and with Tomb of Horrors, where I've run those, I'm intimately familiar with them. And then under a different GM, I've played in them. And it's hard. It's hard to not, to just stay in character and not make decisions based on, yeah, exactly. But I think, again, that comes down to that social contract. You have to have an agreement. It is so hard for me to not read Waterdeep Dragon Heist because Mike Lasham is running the game. Megan and I are both players in it. And I have bought every single D&D adventure and read through it up until Waterdeep Dragon Heist and Dungeon of the Mad Mage because I know Mike intends to run them. I can't promise I won't eventually look at them, but I don't want to spoil things right now. It's really fun not knowing what's going to happen, which is hard for me in a 5th edition pre-written module.
So you talk a lot about the pre-written contract, which I think is a really good thing to call it. And I think that it is different when players are playing in a pre-written module as opposed to just them playing in a campaign. I think that there has to be a certain amount of acceptance with the fact that things are going to happen and you need to be susceptible to follow along kind of with those things. Is there any other tips you would give a player who is going into a pre-written module to help out the GM to make sure that they're not kind of hindering the DM, like you had said, with them maybe reading ahead and then maybe them assuming things that they, what kind of advice would you give to them?
Yeah. What's the perfect player look like for a pre-written module?
I'll let you know when I find them. I think that probably the most important piece of advice I could give to a player, if you know you're going to be playing in a pre-written campaign, and if your GM is is worth their salt, your Dungeon Master is worth their salt, they're going to tell you, hey guys, I picked up the new Tomb of Annihilation. Do you guys want to play in this world? Because there has to be an agreement on both sides. Though there are some play groups that are perfectly happy to do whatever their GM puts in front of them. Too often players make their characters in a bubble. There are people that have characters that they always bring a variation of that character to a game. Like it's a character they've been playing for years. Joe Magniello did it with Critical Role when he guested on there with his Ark and the Cruel, Dragonborn, Oathbreaker Paladin. He's been playing that character for years, and so he brought it into this campaign. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that character might not be right for Tomb of Annihilation or Storm King's Thunder. And what I mean when I say players make their characters in a bubble is they just make a character that they want. All they think about is themselves and the character they want to play. They don't think about where that character is going to be in relation to the world. I mean, the worst case example would be to make a Kender from Dragonlance when you're going to be playing in Faerun and they don't really fit into, that world setting. You want to make something that is going to have a place in the world. And just simply by communicating with your Dungeon Master, it's going to make it better. Plus, it's going to make it easier for your Dungeon Master to maybe give you some examples of things that you might try out. For instance, again, I vaguely remember, it's been almost a year, but when you were first creating Berlinia for Tomb of Annihilation, we had some back and forth. And I had the same thing with all the other players about once you kind of said, well, I'm thinking about playing an Aasimar Warlock, and then you would throw some things at me and I would say, well, what if she has this kind of a thing? Or you would maybe know about this. And that gives you some more ideas to kind of build off of. And a GM who's read their module is going to be able to pull things out of that module and directly relate it to your players. Drake's in the first part of the campaign when Drake was playing Ubo, the Tortle Monk, Tortles came out, were released shortly after as a supplement with Tomb of Annihilation. And they actually come from an island just to the south of Chult. So there was a direct connection to the region there. But yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing you can do as a player is just talk to your GM and have a back and forth.
Yeah, so you're trying to build your character. You can ask your GM, well, I want to have this kind of scenario. I want to be part of a monastery. You can ask them, what kind of monasteries are there in this place that I could be connected to, right? Is that maybe what you're suggesting more of? Instead of this is the monastery and I want you, the DM, to plug this into the world for me thing?
Yeah, there are certain... Are you saying the player says the monastery they're from and then the DM has to make that work within their world?
Yeah, as in you have two choices of a player, as a player. you can develop this backstory, like, hey, I'm from this academy named such and such, and then basically you're telling the DM, right, that this academy exists in your world because it's part of the backstory. Or you can be the kind of player who's like, well, I want them to be from an academy, and I'll email my DM or I'll message my DM, hey, what academies are there in your session or in your world?
I think there's actually room for both of those. So Megan did that with Berlinia by creating the Weeping Friars and kind of building some of that lore as we went. Each time she created a piece of lore, she's establishing something that exists somewhere else within our world. And I'm taking those building blocks and kind of playing with them. And forming them into something. Now, when you came into the campaign just a few sessions ago, I didn't give you any guidelines other than your character is in a cage. Once you told me what you wanted to play, when you said, I want to play an Aarakocra, then I was like, that's perfect because they're on their way to Kir Sabal, which is an Aarakocra monastery. So, but if you had said, I guess it would have depended. I mean, any other race class combination, I would have found a way for it to make sense within this world.
If I had been like, I want to be a dragonborn barbarian from a frigid land, you would have been like,
right off the bat,
far away from home,
Well, as Megan knows, the frost giants are in Chult in the jungle looking for Artisimber and the Ring of Winter. So it makes sense that you would be sent down from the north to see what's going on with the frost giants. You see how fast I did that? Because I know the module and I know the way that it ties in. Worst case, I might tell you, you know what? Let me think on that for a little bit and I'll get back to you.
So it's just a good or sign of a good module then, if it like has all of these possible connections for basically, the entire cast of possibilities. If like I could fit a Northland, frigid barbarian and also this weird bird person monk who lives in a monastery 500 feet off the ground, or, a turtle from a mysterious island.
I think that's a combination of a well-written module, a combination of a good DM, and a combination of just Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons really doesn't ask any questions. It's built on this, motley crew, really, of weird race class combinations that there's no reason these people should be together, and yet they are. But Tomb of Annihilation is one that really does it well. They give, because of the death curse and all of the treasure that supposedly has mysteriously eluded your party, but all of the treasure that's supposedly available in this jungle, it makes sense that there would be other adventurers wandering around throughout the jungle, and they literally tell you this is how you can bring in, if a character dies, they can bring in another character, or you can introduce new party members, is you stumble into them through the jungle or whatever reason. It just happened to work really well for where we already were when you came in, but I would have figured out a way to make it work regardless. The really cool thing is the session, almost always your session becomes about that new character. It becomes meeting that new character, which is great. I think it's great if you're running those kind of games where you're taking the time to tell character stories. The audience, even if that audience is just us at the table hearing that story, we want to know where you come from and who you are.
So I think that with the player, the character creation, it's a lot of give and take between the DM and the player. And for players, you shouldn't be too attached to your ideas as rigid as they are. You have to be able to make changes, make small adjustments if you are trusting that your GM, I hope you're trusting your GM, will, has this overview and can fit it in where they see fit. So kind of jumping back over the DM screen to the DM, what would you say that people shouldn't get hung up over when it comes to a pre-written module?
Don't get hung up on all the tiny details. If a module tells you that, and I'm going to go all the way back to the very first 5th edition module, not counting the starter set, Horde of the Dragon Queen. If the module tells you your characters are arriving, walking together alongside the road, and they are nearing the town of Greenest, it's evening, and you see a blue dragon swooping overhead and flames rising from the city. And oh, by the way, you're all level 1. When I ran that, the first thing my party said was, do we have to go to Greenest? Which kind of right away it breaks that social contract of, well, yeah, you agreed to do this, but there's nothing that says that you have to start where the module says to start. You can move further back in the storyline, take the time for the players to meet on the road, meet in a tavern, start with a bar fight, and one of the players is in a bar fight as the other one's walking in, and that's how they meet. Take the time to introduce the characters to the story. If it doesn't work for you, or the way things are flowing for Greenest to be under attack at night and the players come up on the attack, have them in the tavern having a bar fight in the town of Greenest when the dragon attacks. It's that simple. I actually was just thinking about that today, because Horde of the Dragon Queen and Tyranny of Dragons campaign is my white whale. It's one that I really want to be able to run that entire campaign, but it's not a great example of a well put together adventure module. I'll say that. And a big part of that is it wasn't written by Wizards of the Coast.
Right. So I think we're coming up to close to the end of our time. Do you have any last tips and tricks for new DMs who are, or I guess experienced DMs who just want to run a module?
Don't be afraid of modules. I think too many people really are afraid of them. A lot of people, especially people that are relatively new to D&D, I see questions all the time. I'm brand new to D&D. I'm building my own world right now. Do you have any advice? Wow. You just put on the big DM pants, jumped into the deep end, and realized you couldn't swim. I think modules are a great way to kind of approach the story with training wheels on. You can't go wrong starting with the starter set. And when it comes to a system like 5th edition that has such a long life, but I mean, you could do this now with any of the previous editions. You can just do a little bit of research and get the sense for which adventures, read reviews to see how the different adventures are, who's talked about which adventures the most, and figure out which one seems like it would fit your style and be easier for you to run. And players shouldn't be afraid of playing in a pre-written module, because it doesn't mean that you're stuck in a storyline and you have to follow, all of these laid out tracks on a train track. Just let the world happen around you. Trust your DM to build a story, and you guys will go on this magical pretend journey that, with Tomb of Annihilation, we've talked about several times here, our Cult of Personality campaign. That is the longest running campaign that I have ever DM'd. We've been playing for almost a year with an average of 2 to 2.5 hours per session. We've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or 80 hours in this campaign. And it's just amazing to look at where these characters are, what they've been through. And when I look back on that stuff, I don't see, oh yeah, this is where I was in chapter 12 and I pulled that thing over here. No, I see the wreckage of the Star Goddess and the trees above you, protecting you from the rain, dead zombie dinosaurs around you from when you slayed them, all of you falling to sleep as these figures move down as shadows from the treetops, and Dunala's eyes glowing in the dark as he prepares to light a fireball and just blow everything down. So, yeah, I mean, why would you be afraid of a module? I highly encourage modules, especially if you are, if you're somebody like me that works full time and you have other things that you're doing, or for some reason you say, I want to run 3 or 4 campaigns simultaneously. They can cut down on your need to over prep or prep too much stuff. If I could literally right now grab one of these books right here, tell you guys to grab a pre-gen character, and we could run a 2-hour session off of that. because I'm familiar with all these modules.
That is some fantastic final advice. So I think we'll end on that. So thank you again so much for coming on, giving your sagely advice to us. And his link with all of his socials will be down in the description description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe this video, and thank you for watching.